Munzir Slimani with Wasaf, newspaper in Kuwait. I think one book would be sufficient, and not because of the presence of Michael, but if you read just Michael's book will be sufficient education for him. Maybe one chapter would be sufficient. I was struck by the selective utility of intelligence by the president and others. And yesterday he talked about bin Laden being ordering others to mobilize their forces in Iraq. The issue here is, again, for Mr. Giuliani and for the president, is to look at the declaration of bin Laden. Bin Laden declared, when he declared war, he announced why he's doing this. And it was alluded in Michael's book about it, and it's clearly about, at the core of it is US foreign policy. But I think the underlying issue, it seems to me, from both parties, frankly, is that the issue of foreign policy, in the final analysis, the issue of the blind support of Israel. Both parties, they don't want foreign policy in the issue to be discussed, because at the core of all of this, it will open the debate about US historical position, blind support of Israel. What do you think if they are trying to eliminate any kind of debate, debating whether this support is legitimate or not?
You know, I think you make a very good point. But if I say that without clarification, you know how I would be labeled.
Yes.
But I think it is true and very important. But to be honest, you can still encapsulate that in the overall policy, because you could, if I wanted to, I could talk about our blind support for Saudi Arabia for 50 years, causing a lot of trouble too, and that's what helped precipitate, Osama bin Laden. So it's the overall policy that's important. I think one thing, the House is intimidated by the influence of AIPAC. Everybody knows that. And yet, it's interesting to me to have just read that the religious group most opposed, who disagree with the war, have gone in and said it was a mistake, have been American Jews. 77% it's been a mistake. So I think if we get to the overall position of discussing foreign policy and include Israel, and include Saudi Arabia, include Iran, and include Iraq, I mean, all these things come together, and we can deal with it more in an academic way rather than stirring up another hornet's nest. But I'm not uncomfortable with my position, because quite frankly, I think our policies long term, our policies are not good for Israel. I think eventually they will backfire. Just like our policy for Saudi Arabia has been beneficial. We've kept the kings in power, but we've also stirred up the resentment of the fundamentalists, and if who knows what kind of an overthrow of that government. So to me, I stick with the overhaul the downside of interventionist foreign policy. Michael, did you have anything to add on that?
The only thing that I would say is that
microphone, please.
I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you.
At the end of the day, foreign policy is about protecting America. It's not about much other than that. The founders thought foreign and defense policy were to guarantee the expansion, consolidation, and growth of democracy at home, not installing democracy overseas. And our foreign policy is doing just the opposite at the moment. It's trying to install democracy in places where there is no ready acceptance for it. And as we do that, we're clearly eroding civil liberties at home.
Senators, Sarah Wheaton from the New York Times. Senators Clinton and Byrd have introduced legislation to sunset the authorization. Are you endorsing their position, and what would be the practical impact of that sunset if it passes?
She asked about the legislation by, it was Clinton and Byrd. And yeah, basically, I support that, but I have not signed on, nor have I introduced that legislation. I've introduced a variation of that, because if you sunset today, you haven't answered the problem of how to work a transition. And if you, too often when we want to move away, we get accused of not supporting the troops and we're un-American. So my approach was a very moderate, modest approach. Rather than sunsetting it today and it's over tomorrow, Mine is a sunset. It's to sunset the authority by amending the original authority that 180 days after that bill is passed, they no longer have authority. Because in a way, the authority, like I mentioned before, is defunct. The conditions don't exist for the reasons that we went in. So mine is very close to that, but mine I think is more moderate in the sense that I'm providing 6 months for the Congress to assume their responsibility, because it's the Congress that should be responsible for the policy and the funding. And rather than turning it all over to the executive branch and rolling over and doing whatever the executive branch wants. So I have not co-sponsored their legislation, but very sympathetic with what they're trying to do.
But would there be a troop allowed in 6 months if?
No, it depends on what the Congress would be forced to do something. If we went 6 months and procrastinated for 6 more months and the Congress did nothing, then the president would no longer have authority and he'd have to start moving out. But what I would hope, the intention is for Congress to get off their duff and do something during that 6 months and redo the authority or remove the authority or declare war or whatever they're supposed to do, and not just leave this in limbo. I mean, and leave it in the entire hands of the executive branch.
It's one thing to say that American foreign policy motivates our enemies, which I think is your point. In the debate, it seemed like Giuliani was accusing you of saying that there was a causal effect between the Gulf War in the early 1990s and the attack on September 11th. Were you saying, I'm hoping you can clarify, do you think, like, if we had not gone to Iraq, for instance, and never had troops stationed in Saudi Arabia in the early 90s, are you suggesting that maybe that means we would not have had the attack?
No, but what Giuliani was saying is that I was blaming America, I was blaming you. And of course, that's preposterous. Yes, but I stick to my point that our foreign policy has a great deal of influence on the motives of Al-Qaeda. And those are explicit. I mean, they're very clear. But to go back and say, well, you'd have to go way back. I mean, we had hostages taken in '79, but you can't understand that if you don't understand 1953. And to say that if we didn't go into Iraq and hadn't bombed them for 10 years, would they have been motivated? The gentleman here suggested that Israel was still, a thorn in their side. The idea that we supported Saudi Arabia, even without troops on their border, that had always annoyed the radical Islamists. So to say that it would be completely removed, no. But it might not nearly have been bad. But the important thing about Robert Pape's book is they need something really forceful to get somebody to commit suicide terrorism, and that is occupation. And it's most likely not the religion, because the country that commits the greatest amount of suicide terrorism is Sri Lanka. And there's essentially no suicide terrorism coming from the Iranians. There wasn't any suicide terrorism in Iraq until the current mess that we've helped create. So it is occupation. You have foreign forces on their soil. That is the recruiting device of Al-Qaeda. And if we don't understand that, and they turn around and they blame me for blaming Americans, and that isn't clarified, the country's in serious trouble.